Hi class. Welcome to the first of our experiments in online class. We're going to be talking about sexualities and the family today. As the slide indicates, it's an area of ongoing change, an enormous change since the time, for instance, of the colonial folks that we talked about in our history section. Looking at an example of your, in your text, there's a letter from Alexander Hamilton. This is 18th century, 1700s. And he's saying things to his friend, another man, who he talks about, can I prove to you that I love you? Wishing he could. Now this is the way many letters were written at that time. Those words to us today would indicate a romantic, sexual relationship. At the time, many people were writing this. Scholars of the period think that's not what it meant at the time, but we don't know. But the important point about this is that the historical context is one of the freedom to form close friendships without anybody disparaging them or labeling them as some sort of other. What's new about sexual identities in the last 150 years is the way sexual acts and preferences are socially organized. They've become a defining way of how we see people, a way of defining who a person is. Not true in the 1700s. So here's a definition that your book gives of sexual identity. A set of sexual practices and attitudes that lead to the formation in a person's mind of an identity as heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, or one of several other identities such as transgender. Okay, sexual acts are different from sexual identities. There are many more people who, as we will see in a minute, engage in sexual acts that might be defined as other, as gay, for instance, but who don't adopt an identity as such. Before the 19th century, there were two kinds of sexual activities. Those that society approved of, and that was heterosexual intercourse in marriage, that was about it, and socially disapproved, seen often mostly as sinful. But still, performing disapproved sex and getting caught did not get somebody defined as having a particular sexual identity that was deviant. The concept of orientation toward the same sex began to emerge in the 19th century. Men and women were recognized and punished for same-sex attraction. So what was a result of that? They found ways to get together among themselves where it was safe in things like a secret underground social club in areas where there were enough people to do that. Still, sexual orientation wasn't central to who one was, one's sense of self. Late in the 19th century, there was a public campaign against homosexual acts and persons, labeling them as psychologically ill. Heterosexuals are healthy, homosexuals were sick in this judgment. This was a medical model, and it was dominant until first chink in it, 1973, the American Psychiatric Association removed it from its list of mental disorders. The American Psychiatric Association, as many of you know, publish the diagnostic manual for mental illness, and this was their 1973 edition that took it out. Very controversial at the time. Okay, this medical model stigmatized, of course, homosexual people, and it justified prejudice and discrimination. If these people are sick, who would want to associate with them? Who would want to hire them, rent to them, etc.? But it was also the impetus for a group identity and eventually social and political action, which became the gay rights movement later. Now, what develops a sexual identity? What develops a preference? One perspective on this is the social constructivist perspective. Sexual identities are entirely socially created. And their evidence for this is the unclear boundaries of the two-gender, heterosexually dominant model. We saw this in the Two Spirits people in an earlier chapter. We see it in the friendships that we just talked about. You can see it when you look back in history. Greece and Rome did not stigmatize this. In Greece, they felt that soldiers fought better if they had lovers in their unit. And certainly the attitude toward same-sex attraction and sexual acts varies a lot from culture to culture. Now the Kinsey report is another bit of evidence for seeing that there's a lot of variation within our society that we don't take account of in the system that we have for sexual identity, dividing people into heterosexual and homosexual. They're going to see it more as a continuum. Okay? The Kinsey report came out in 1948. It was a bestseller, it was a blockbuster, and the findings shocked the world. Half of their male sample acknowledged homoerotic feelings. Half. A third of these men acknowledged at least one sexual experience with another man. 1/8 had sexual experience predominantly with other men for at least 3 years. The proportions were higher than anybody had imagined. The conclusion, sexual orientation is along a continuum. Now, even though Kinsey's conclusions still stand, his figures don't represent the population now or even then, because his sample was only of white, young, well-educated folks, men, from the Midwest and Northeast. So how do sociologists learn about sexual behavior and attitudes? Primarily they ask people. Random sample survey, one way. Newer computer-assisted self-interview. There are still limits because are respondents being truthful with the researcher? And are they being honest with themselves? Now, a recent survey of Americans ages 15 to 44, you can see a chart of it on page 185. They confirm the Kinsey report's conclusion that sexual orientation is multidimensional. And a continuum is one way to understand it. It suggests there's no clear dividing line between homosexuality and heterosexuality. The percentage of Americans who think of themselves as homosexual or bisexual is lower than the percentage who have ever had some same-sex experience or find it appealing. Now another perspective, okay, different perspective, takes more account of biology, integrative perspective, seeing sexual orientation as determined by both social and biological factors. They see social construction as important, but they see biological action as well. They get their evidence from twin studies, which show that the probability of an identical twin having the same orientation as the SIB is higher than one would expect by chance. They see genes as creating predispositions, something they did not find, and it's important to know that they did not find, is they didn't find differences in parental treatment. They didn't see parenting as producing sexual orientation. They also found no evidence that orientation is learned from adults, countering the popular myth that homosexuals recruit the young. It's not learned from adults. There's no evidence that it is. Okay. So there were some political implications. If homosexuality isn't a lifestyle choice, but something inherent, something biological, at least in elements, and an inherent part of someone's personality, there's little justification for restricting the legal rights of gay men and lesbians. And many people say, even if they weren't true, there shouldn't be restrictions anyway. Now we come to our first set of forum questions that I told you about last class. Here you're going to join your forum group that you're assigned to, and you're going to answer these questions in a dialogue among yourselves on the Sakai forum.